I'll be the first one to admit, when it comes to online cooperative survival games, that's usually a recipe that will almost always incentivize me to buy your game. I love the prospect of surviving both on my own and occasionally with friends in an ever-changing world full of both risk and reward. That said, one of the greatest flaws with the survival genre has always been an extreme lack of imagination in almost every aspect of the game design, from both the visual aesthetic to the gameplay mechanics themselves, and more or less everything in between. And these flaws are often so common that good original survival games are more often the exception than they are the rule. So you can easily see why I was originally so excited to check out a game like vrising here the day it released. The colorful visual aesthetic pops out at you quite vividly. The general vampiric theme and accompanying overtones provided a promising change of pace, where instead of being the victim of a more dangerous world, you're arguably just as great a monster as those around you, and ultimately you grow to be even more monstrous over time. In essence, instead of playing the victim, you find yourself playing the villain, at least if we're talking about the general overview. You're often just doing what you have to do in order to survive, but good luck explaining that to the village you just partially depopulated. vrising is at its core both a PvP and a PvE game. How you choose to experience a game is ultimately left largely to you. While there are a decent number of official servers you can join and play with other random players on, you can alternatively do as I did and just play on your own in a private server. When it comes down to it, I've never been all that interested in hardcore PvP experiences, where other players can attack you in the wild and steal your loot, or take over and destroy your home. All that comes across to me as simply being mean-spirited, and I know for some that might be the point, and that's why they enjoy that kind of thing, but for me, it's just not what I enjoy in video games, so PvE it was. Assuming you're looking to start up your own server, whether to play solo or with friends, vrising does give you a decent amount of adjustable sliders and options to customize your in-game experience. Most of these come in the form of value multipliers, such as loot multipliers, blood essence multipliers, etc. As well as on the flip side, certain modifiers to potentially slow or increase the rate at which certain items can be consumed or the number of certain placeable items you can place. Examples include castle heart limits per person, limiting the total number of servants each player can have, etc. Assuming you're playing on one of the dedicated servers rather than a custom server, you'll just play on whatever the default settings are. I quite like the extensive degree of customization options readily available to the player in the pre-game settings. Although, unless the player is already familiar with all the game's core mechanics, which would be highly unlikely if their first experience with the game is through the custom game option, they will probably find themselves quite confused as to what option does what. This is one area where I think the developers should probably consider elaborating on. There are two viable solutions that come to my mind. The first being the easiest, in which the developers can make it so whenever the player hovers their cursor above a particular option, a small pop-up box of text will appear, providing a basic explanation of what that option entails. The somewhat more complex alternative being what other games like Lost Ark or Shadow of Mordor have done, in which whenever the player hovers over said option, they not only get a small pop-up text box, but also a short video clip or a GIF showing a visual demonstration of that option in-game. Either way, what's the point of adding so many sliders and on-off options if no new player is going to have a clue what they mean and what they do? Moving on to the survival mechanics, at least those that are actually present, because this is, at least in name only, a survival game. As a newly reawakened vampire, you survive by drinking blood. Pretty self-explanatory when you get right down to it. That said, it doesn't always have to be human blood. In order to obtain blood, you need to either attack a human or some kind of animal and get it to about a third of its health, before you then see this pop-up option telling you to press down on the F key in order to suck their blood. That still leaves the question of whether or not you actually want to do that. Not due to any kind of morality system, don't get me wrong, nothing like that. Nothing of any actual complexity or depth. But rather because blood will always be of a randomized value with differing levels of purity. Yes, for gameplay reasons, we literally have a blood purity test here in vrising. Try not to think about that one too hard, will you? Blood is quite important to the gameplay. The amount of human or animal blood in your system, represented on screen in the form of that circular vial in the middle, acts similarly to mana in other RPG games, albeit with the notable difference being that here in vrising, your store of blood is not self-sustaining, and neither is it self-replenishing. Once you're out, you're out. That's it. Running out of blood has several unpleasant consequences. For one, you'll be unable to use any of your special vampiric abilities, which you can use to help change the tide of battle in a tricky situation, and it can lead you to more easily getting killed by enemies. And not having them can lead you to more easily get killed by enemies. Since some of your vampiric abilities do have other uses other than being combative, some provide you certain stealth and movement abilities that can be beneficial in a number of other situations. One of my favorites allows me to transform myself into a wolf, which appears to grant a small movement speed increase, and allows me to pass by humans undetected, as long as I don't get too close to them. Basically, as long as I don't literally bump right into them, they won't likely attack me. So not having access to this and other similar abilities can make you incredibly vulnerable to attack. And all this is without taking into account the ultimate drawback. If you let your blood meter run out completely for a lengthy period of time, the game will start arbitrarily dealing damage over time to your character until you die, assuming you're not able to drain a new source of blood in that very limited window of time. As I mentioned a moment ago, the quality of said blood can range, represented in percentage form, ranging from 1% quality to 100% quality. And believe me, I've drained a decent number of people at either extreme end of that spectrum, as well as many more in between. While the game doesn't make it absolutely clear what the difference ultimately is when it comes to blood quality, it does seem as if lower quality blood is consumed at a faster rate when using your abilities, although the steady passive decrease of normal passive consumption itself doesn't appear to be much different. Of course, eliminating humans or animals can also produce other valuable loot that can help you continue to meet your basic needs. Eliminating human NPCs will gain you a chance at obtaining either sullied or unsullied hearts, in addition to the comparatively far more common blood essence. Sullied hearts are fairly common drops for both human and animal NPCs, and are all but guaranteed in cases where the player has eliminated said NPC by draining them of their blood. Unsullied hearts are far rarer by comparison, and as a result offer up far more value. Both can be used as crafting ingredients at a number of crafting stations within your castle, especially once you progress into the later game. In order to cement your position within the world of vrising, one of the first things you'll need to do is build a castle. In order to build said castle, you'll need to first place a castle heart into the foundation of your castle. Once this is done, you'll then need to go about building your fortress. The castle will start out initially being rather small. That said, you can choose to upgrade your castle over time, which will greatly increase the maximum potential size of your castle. The castle you're looking at on screen hasn't reached that aforementioned max size, but it's still a respectable size. For me, it works perfectly fine. I designed this fortress with utility first and foremost in mind, not presentational quality. How you choose to design your castle, of course, is mostly up to you. I have a bit of an axe to grind when it comes to the base building in the game. Not for the reasons you might suspect, like a lack of different building structures or cosmetic styles, but instead due to the system itself. For reasons beyond understanding, the developers bragged prior to release that their building system was deliberately designed to not allow for multi-level building, because they thought, for some asinine reason, that forcing players to build everything only at the ground level would force players to be more creative. I refer to this as asinine because I can only assume these crackheads never considered the obvious fact that nothing could be possibly less creative than putting everything on one flat, sprawling surface. It just creates unnecessary bloat and greatly increases walking distances. Also, whoever heard of a castle only having one floor? Historically, even the castle walls themselves were always at least one floor above the courtyard, with the towers and main structure usually being several additional floors in height beyond that. Also, where are the inclusion of dungeons, wine cellars, and other subterranean floors? Most castles usually had at least one floor below the ground, sometimes more than one in the case of larger castles. While I don't mind the idea of having a limited vertical size for your castle on the outside will look larger than it actually is on the inside. If you just glance at the exterior of your castle or someone else's, it already looks like there's more than one floor, but this is just due to the roof being so insanely high. So much of the base building is oriented around production, to the point where superficial decoration takes a complete backseat by comparison. In the current build of the game, the only cosmetic decorations that exist are so limited in variety and in numbers that the takeaway impression is that they were designed to be placed only as additional items in a room dedicated to some other purpose. The idea of a non-production room as a fully independent recreational room doesn't appear to have crossed the developers' minds at any point while making vrising. If you're looking to buy the game based on the developer's lofty promises about base building, my recommendation is that you'd get just as much value out of pouring gasoline on your $20 bill and setting it on fire as you would from playing vrising for its base building mechanics. Games like The Forest on their worst day are 10 times better than vrising is on its best day. But let's say you don't care about base building. It's one of those necessities that you have to take care of before you go off adventuring. Whatever. What's the combat like? As I mentioned before, over time, some of the special abilities you unlock can be kinda cool visually, but when it comes to the combat system itself, it is uninspired, rudimentary, and fundamentally boring. And since so much of the game revolves around combat, since there is no morality system, nor trading, nor negotiation with the human NPCs, the fact that it is so utterly lifeless, combined with how often you have to engage in it, is another one of the game's biggest detracting elements. It's highly perplexing, because the developers have illustrated in-game that they have the capacity to create a far more sophisticated combat system, since the open-world bosses you'll fight at varying points in the game have lots of different attacks as well as an overall unique combat strategy unique to that boss. Some prefer to stay at range at all times, some prefer stealth, etc. So again, it's no lack of ability, but rather the developer's own pig-headed stupidity. Normally I would avoid using such language since I try to direct my criticism at the product rather than the individuals, but since the developers have an extensive history of treating fan feedback with dismissive, arrogant contempt, I in turn feel I owe little to no consideration for their own personal feelings, in regards to me treating them to a small taste of their own medicine. If you're going to display this holier-than-thou attitude as a developer, at least bring an equal amount of talent with you to substantiate that claim. Which, aside from creating what is visually a very pretty world and providing a decent array of custom game options, these guys ultimately failed to deliver in nearly every single respect. For a game that has a opening story-driven, voice-narrated cutscene, there is absolutely nothing in the vein of storytelling in the actual gameplay, and neither is there anything in the vein of quests, despite the fact that the game does have a built-in questing system, with objectives that you have to fulfill before moving on to the next quest. The problem is that these quests are presented with no context, no story material to flesh out the world, and basically serve no actual purpose beyond being a pointlessly drawn out tutorial, which goes on for your first 6 or so hours in-game, and will unlock various items for you. Every moment I spent attempting to fulfill them made me feel like I was checking off household chores on a list. None of it is fun to do, none of them offer satisfying rewards, and almost all the rewards being offered are basically just objects required to fulfill the next linear objective. Your reward for completing an objective is just a new objective. How is this anything resembling good game design? It feels unnecessarily stiff, clunky, and arbitrary. Not the kind of adjectives you'd normally want to associate with a good game. Moving on to the last point on my list is the game's performance. vrising ran decently enough on my system. If you're simply running around the world, the game will run smoothly enough on high or max settings. However, it's in combat that things go downhill with unexpected velocity. I can only assume it's an issue with how particle effects and other special visual effects are rendered in, but I experienced a metric ton of frame drops, screen tearing, and lag during certain boss fights and large group fights. To the best of my knowledge, this hasn't yet been fixed, since I don't see any listed fixes when I went back and reread the patch notes prior to recording this video. So I can only assume the developers have done what they've done in most other cases with this game, and just ignored the issue and pretended it doesn't exist. Overall, vrising presents a great premise and a wonderfully diverse world, with lots of different biomes and enemy types for you to pit yourself against. In terms of getting the general broad ideas right, it does a great job. Where it fails with embarrassing disgrace is in its handling of the more specific mechanics and systems that the player will most often rely upon throughout their time in-game. And that's assuming the servers stay online without crashing seemingly every half hour or so due to the developer's haphazard back-end server management. While it's fair to say that vrising from day one was a more successful hit game than the developers had probably anticipated, so some technical problems were doubtlessly going to occur. That neither explains nor excuses the continually poor handlement of these issues in the days, weeks, and now months that have followed the game's initial release. The point of an early access game is to spend a year or two not just adding new features, but improving on and fixing what's already there. The excuse from fans of, oh, it's only an early access game, so you can't criticize it for having problems, only has credibility if the developers provide substantial proof that they're aware of said problems and are actively working to address them, and the developers' efforts thus far, from what I've seen, have been laughable at best. Maybe vrising will be this amazing survival ARPG experience a year or two from now. Something beyond reproach. But right now, I couldn't recommend buying it even if it was 90% off on Steam. It's not worth your time right now, let alone your money. That said, that's where I'm going to wrap it up for today, because I really don't want to spend a single minute talking about this game any longer than I've already done so. I've punished myself enough on behalf of you guys, and now's a good time to call it a wrap. As ever, if you enjoyed this video, way more than you'll enjoy this game, be sure to click the like button and comment below what you think of the game. I look forward to it. Comments help my videos get boosted in the algorithm, and plus, I read and respond to nearly all the comments I get. So whether you want to talk about vrising for reasons beyond understanding, or you want to talk about something else, there's a comment section down below. I look forward to hearing from you. Likewise, subscribing and clicking the bell really helps. I know it's cliche, but the YouTube algorithm is a pain in the ass to deal with, doubly so as a small channel. This is Warrior Dan signing out. Stay awesome, everybody. Stay safe and peace out.